Dune is a masterpiece, but I don't care about it. You don't care about it, and no one cares about Dune the same way that they care about these other generational franchises like Star Wars and Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter. And Dune is one of the best selling sci fi novels of all time. The first movie was super well received, and the second movie is getting 10 out of 10s on every review source that I look at. Dune has one of the most expansive and in depth sci fi worlds, all thanks to Frank Herbert and Denis Villeneuve. And Timothy Chalamet and Zendaya are in these movies. Why are they not as big as Avengers Endgame? Why are there not Dune spiced flavored pancakes? And why are there not lollipops that taste like stillsuit sweat? Well, I'd argue that it was never meant to be a lovable franchise. The story, in its simplest state, is a commentary on politics and religion. It doesn't have a cast of lovable characters that's meant to make jokes every 30 seconds to keep the Disney executive from behind the desk from bursting into flames. But I still see a lot of people saying that this is going to be the next Lord of the Rings and that we're going to look back on this series in 20 years. I think it has a lot to do with the fact that the movie has a huge budget and it's cast some of the biggest blockbuster stars working today, but I just don't see it. The movie came out in 2021. You saw it, you loved it, and then you forgot about it for 2.5 years until the trailer for part 2 came out. Then you saw part 2, you loved it, and you're gonna forget about it again for another 2 years until part 3 comes out. And to understand why this movie doesn't have the same mainstream staying power, I think it's important to look at the movie's heart and the movie's soul. And to me, these are two very different things. Heart is the beating pulse of the movie. It's why we should care about the characters and what's happening to them. Soul, however, is the sauce of the movie. Is the world interesting? How are the visuals? Did the director's vision make it uncompromised to the big screen? And the movie's marketing campaign even uses soul as a quote on their ads. And I think Dune is dripping in sauce, but it really lacks in the heart that could amplify this saga to Star Wars proportions. But before we talk about heart, I want to talk a little bit more about soul and why I feel like these movies were so close to hitting the mark that could have taken them into that classic territory. And first up is the world. Frank Herbert has made one of the most convincing sci-fi worlds ever, where everything has a purpose and nothing is unexplained. This makes the story both really cool and complicated. But let's just focus on the really cool for a second. You ever wonder why everyone fights with swords instead of guns? It's not really explained in the movies, but I'm sure that you noticed that all the characters in this story are basically wearing these energy shields from Halo. Well, they were made to block bullets, and only slow-moving objects with steady force can really penetrate them. The shields also combust when lasers hit them, so unless you want to blow yourself up in the process, you can't use las guns either. The world's response to this problem was to go back to a more primitive, impersonal form of fighting that creates new paths for the story to play out, which is basically exactly what lightsabers did for Star Wars. We don't get a formal explanation of this in the movie because we don't really need one. Swords in space sound good to me, and I bet you didn't question it either. But there's a lot of little things like this in the story that probably could have used a little bit more explaining. Other franchises like Lord of the Rings have much deeper worlds than what you see on the screen, but I think Peter Jackson did a little bit better of a job of giving the viewer every single thing that they needed to know to understand the world. Whereas Denis Villeneuve left out a few key elements that I think really would have enhanced the viewer's understanding. But let's focus on what Denis Villeneuve did right, because he made this world look flawless. And unlike Anakin, this guy loves sand. He leaned into the fact that Arrakis is a wasteland, and he wasn't afraid to make the world feel dirty and lived in. And he seems to exist in this 2002 headspace where he actually wanted to make visual effects look good instead of rushing something out unfinished, which unfortunately is all too common in 2024. And other planets like Caladan and Getty Prime contrast Arrakis so heavily that they're really intriguing to the eye and give a great amount of visual diversity to what the viewer's watching. So huge props to Denis and the team that he assembled here. I really have no notes on this area of the film and the other technical aspects as well. The sound design is impeccable and it utilizes silence in a brilliant way. Too often these days do I watch movies where battles are just drowned out by orchestral swells that are meant to intensify the moment, but really just make the movie feel like a product rather than something intimate. The sound designers on this one really let you hear the clang of swords and the shifting of the sand, and I think it's one of the most overlooked parts of filmmaking these days, and Dune absolutely nailed it. I could go on and on about how each department absolutely crushed it in their respective fields, but I think it's easier to say that the craftsmanship on this film is really just second to none. It was assembled with the finest care, and it really stands on a league of its own when compared with other films that are coming out today. So you'd think that with this deep lore and the really interesting visuals that this would be the perfect sandbox for really interesting characters, right? Well, no. I don't think it is. And like I said earlier, I really think that comes down to the movie's heart. For my money, the most important element of why I should care about a story are its characters. Are they likable? Are they fleshed out? Do you relate to them in some way? And I don't think I can answer any of those questions honestly with a yes. I think this is a problem that started in the books and carries over to the films. The first film has really thin characters, and the second film does try and correct this a bit, but in my opinion, it was too little too late. Because Dune is inherently a story that prioritizes plot over character. Let's look at the first movie, which is basically the Paul show. Yes, there are other characters, but the whole movie is told through Paul's perspective, and he gets by far the most screen time. So I ask you, what happens to Paul the entire first movie that was his choice? Paul's family gets assigned to Arrakis, where he doesn't want to go. His family then gets betrayed, which he can't do anything to help. And then he gets left stranded in the desert and meets the Fremen, and then the movie ends. He isn't able to make a single decision for himself in the entire first movie. And he's the exact same character at the end of the first movie than he was at the beginning. And yes, things happen to him, but he hasn't grown or experienced any sort of character arc. Hell, even when Paul wants to give water to the Iraqi citizens or spare Jamas's life in the duel, the plot always pulls him in a different direction. And this is all while the story is telling you that he might be the most important human being to ever live. He has literally been sculpted to be a messiah. And yes, he obviously makes decisions that progress the story in the second movie, but whether you like it or not, the first book was split into 2 movies. The first film is the way 99% of viewers will start with this franchise, and they won't be able to see their main character have any growth until the start of the second movie. When I compare Paul to protagonists of other movies, it just makes him seem even more thin. Like, think of Frodo during the entirety of Fellowship of the Ring. Like Paul, he gets wrapped up in a situation much bigger than himself. He's given this ring that he knows nothing about and wants nothing to do with. But as the movie progresses, you get to see the evils of Middle-earth. He understands what would happen if he does nothing about it to his loved ones, and he makes the decision to embark on one of the most perilous journeys into Middle-earth. Halfway through the movie, he goes on to chart that path, he has to deal with the death of Gandalf, and he ultimately makes another decision to leave the Fellowship and rid them of the temptation that the ring brings after he sees what happens to Boromir. Frodo is a completely different character at the end of Fellowship than he was at the beginning, and I just can't say that about any character from the first Dune movie, except Duke Leto and Duncan Idaho, who go from being alive to dead. And at the end of the day, I just can't be attached to a character that makes absolutely no difference in the story for the entire first movie. If he was not in that film, the events would have played out the exact same way. But luckily, the second movie addresses this issue head on, and Paul's given an actual character arc. And I think it's a much better movie because of this. Paul ultimately chooses to become one of the Fremen, and he accepts his role as a savior to their people. But from here, a new problem arises, because by the end of the film, Paul is not a likable protagonist. He starts off humble, not wanting to lead the Fremen because he wasn't raised as one of them, and that would be wrong given how strong their culture is. And Chani admires this and teaches him their ways. I'd argue that Chani is the real heart of this movie, and her desire for Paul to stay grounded is based on a real human emotion. She doesn't want to see him get hurt or give in to his quest for revenge, so the audience can relate to her because of this. And when she's left standing while the rest of the Fremen are bowing to Paul at the end of the movie, you just can't help but feel like he's in it for the wrong reasons. By taking a new wife and challenging for the throne, the last image we have of Paul in the entire movie is him breaking the only heart that was visible across 5 hours of screen time. And if I'm being honest, it's a great narrative choice. I don't think protagonists need to be likable to tell a great story, and in this instance, making that choice really carries weight. As I said before, Dune is all about space politics and religion, and this ending leaves a really foreboding tone for what can happen in the third movie. Paul is starting a holy war that goes well beyond his initial mission to liberate the Fremen and get revenge for his father. He's threatening to blow up the spice fields just because the great houses don't accept him. It's a great analogy for politics and religion in society. Are their promises really what they will deliver, and can you trust them along the way? However, despite this being a narratively compelling choice, I think it's going to hold the series back from superstardom in the long run. And it's because this choice removes the relatability and empathy from the series' main character. Paul used the same people that he fought for the entire movie to start a war that they did not sign up for. And yes, they support him, but revenge is clouding his mind. Whether they win or not, lives will be lost. His and their causes are similar but not the same, and he is using the Fremen for his own personal goals. And he makes this decision on his own. There is no one twisting his arm. There is no one asking him to do this. It is just him risking the fate of the galaxy because of his own ego. Let's compare this to Anakin Skywalker, who goes through a very similar journey. Anakin becomes part of an order that is much larger than himself, and he ends up becoming an anti-hero. He slaughters innocent people, and he ends up leading the Empire. But we as the audience are not fully able to cut ties with Anakin. We still remember that little boy from Phantom Menace who was enslaved to Watto and won his freedom in the pod races. We empathize with his desire to become a Jedi Master, and we ultimately understand when he turns to the dark side because it was Palpatine who was pulling the strings all along. Anakin retains his innocence because he's a victim of the system that brought him up. And Paul's father dies, yes, but I'd argue that he is no victim. Fortune favors Paul as soon as he leaves Arrakeen. He finds a new family and enlists an entire army to help fight for him to become the literal emperor. I'm honestly surprised that he cares so much about avenging his father because we never really get to see him that broken up about Leto's death. We never really got to see them bond, and we only get 1 or 2 awkward scenes of them in the beginning of the first movie. So I don't see a victim who is wronged who is looking to right that wrong. I see a child that is claiming power for the wrong reasons under the disguise of his father's death. And for me, that empathy is not earned. So while I think Dune might be telling a more compelling and unique story than other franchises, I don't think it's the next Lord of the Rings. And I don't think it's the next Star Wars. But I'd love to be proven wrong. I'd love for this story to be appreciated for what it did differently. But I fear that certain decisions made in the presentation of this movie will leave it forgotten in a few short years. But what do you think? Do you agree? Can you see where I'm coming from? I'd really love to hear your thoughts. I'd love to hear any thoughts you have because I'm sure you can notice by looking at my channel that it's my first video. I'm not even sure anyone will see this review, so if you made it this far, I really appreciate it. So like, subscribe, do all the YouTube stuff, and comment what you'd want me to talk about next. I'd love to do a video on the Rings of Power or The Dark Knight Rises. So yeah, let me know which one you prefer. And that's all I have. So thanks.